My name is Rajesh Kumar, though for 3 years I applied to jobs as Ryan Cooper because I discovered that my real Indian name was reducing my interview callbacks by approximately 60% despite having an MBA from Duke, 6 years of financial analysis experience, and professional certifications that should have made me a competitive candidate for senior finance positions. At 31, I'm writing this from my office at an investment firm in New York, where I was initially hired as Ryan and only revealed my real name after receiving the offer letter, creating an awkward situation that exposed the systematic name-based discrimination that forces millions of ethnic minorities to whitewash their identities just to get past resume screening algorithms and unconscious bias that equates foreign-sounding names with lesser qualifications, cultural incompatibility, and professional inadequacy. The name discrimination discovery happened by accident during my second year of unemployment after business school, when a friend who worked in corporate recruiting mentioned that she had seen research showing that resumes with ethnic names received significantly fewer callbacks than identical resumes with white-sounding names. I was skeptical because I wanted to believe that my Duke MBA and strong work experience would transcend any name-based bias. But my 9 months of sending out over 200 applications with minimal response suggested that something was systematically preventing me from even getting interviews despite qualifications that should have generated significant employer interest. The experiment I designed was methodologically simple but psychologically devastating. I created 2 identical resumes with the same education, experience, skills, and achievements, but one listed my real name, Rajesh Kumar, while the other used Ryan Cooper, an Americanized version that maintained my initials but erased any evidence of my Indian heritage. Over the next 2 months, I sent both versions to similar job postings in finance, alternating which resume went to which company to control for variations in job requirements and employer preferences. The results were statistically undeniable and emotionally crushing. The Ryan Cooper resume generated callbacks from 43% of applications, while the Rajesh Kumar resume with identical qualifications received responses from only 16% of the same types of positions. I was literally 3 times more likely to get an interview by hiding my ethnic identity than by presenting my authentic self, revealing that name-based discrimination was a massive barrier that had nothing to do with my actual qualifications and everything to do with unconscious bias against foreign-sounding names that signaled I wasn't white. The identity crisis that emerged from this discovery was profound and destabilizing because it forced me to confront the fact that my name, given to me by my parents, carrying centuries of family history and representing my cultural heritage and personal identity, was considered a professional liability in American workplaces. The realization that I would need to hide who I was just to access job opportunities felt like a betrayal of my family, my culture, and myself. But the alternative of remaining unemployed while student loan payments accumulated and savings depleted seemed equally untenable. The whitewashing decision wasn't made lightly or quickly, but after months of watching Ryan's resume generate interview after interview, while Rajesh's identical qualifications were ignored, I made the pragmatic choice to continue using the Americanized name for job applications. I told myself it was temporary, just a way to get past the initial screening bias, and that once I demonstrated my qualifications in person, my actual name wouldn't matter. But the psychological cost of this decision began immediately as I started viewing my real identity as something shameful that needed to be hidden rather than something valuable that should be celebrated. The cultural erasure extended beyond just my name, as I began systematically removing any evidence of my Indian heritage from my resume and LinkedIn profile. My undergraduate degree from the Indian Institute of Technology became IIT without the country identifier. My volunteer work with South Asian student organizations was deleted entirely. My language skills in Hindi and Gujarati were removed. Even my involvement in cultural events and community organizations that connected me to my heritage were erased because they might signal ethnic identity that could trigger the same bias that my name created. The interview deception required developing a complex mental framework for managing my dual identity. I was Ryan on paper, but would need to explain why my appearance didn't match expectations when I showed up for in-person interviews as a brown-skinned Indian man. I developed a practice explanation about how Ryan was a nickname I had adopted for professional context because American colleagues found my real name difficult to pronounce, framing my identity erasure as a courtesy to others rather than acknowledging the discrimination that forced this choice. The name pronunciation trauma was real even though I was the one choosing to hide my name, because the underlying assumption was that Rajesh was too difficult, too foreign, too other for American workplaces, while Ryan was simple, familiar, and acceptably white. The implicit message was that my ethnic identity needed to be managed and minimized rather than respected and valued, creating shame around a name that my parents had chosen with love and cultural significance. The callback success as Ryan was immediate and dramatic. Within 2 weeks of switching exclusively to the Americanized resume, I had 5 interview requests from positions that would have likely ignored the exact same qualifications attached to my real name. The professional opportunities that suddenly opened up confirmed what the experiment had suggested. The barrier to my career advancement wasn't my qualifications, but my identity, and concealing ethnicity was apparently the price of admission to American corporate environments. The first in-person interview as Ryan was psychologically excruciating because I could see the visible surprise on the hiring manager's face when a brown-skinned Indian man walked into the room instead of the white Ryan Cooper she had been expecting based on my resume. The moment of recalibration was brief but obvious as she processed the disconnect between the name on my application and my physical appearance, and I immediately launched into my prepared explanation about the nickname to smooth over the deception before she could voice any concerns. The job offer I eventually received was from a major investment firm where I had interviewed as Ryan and maintained facade throughout the entire hiring process. When I received the offer letter addressed to Ryan Cooper, I faced an ethical dilemma about whether to correct the name before accepting or continue the deception into my actual employment. After agonizing consultations with family and friends, I decided to reveal my real name immediately after accepting the offer, explaining that I had used a professional nickname, but that my legal name was Rajesh Kumar. The workplace reaction to my name revelation was mixed and uncomfortable. Some colleagues laughed it off as a harmless misunderstanding, while others seemed offended that I had deceived them about my identity, as if using my real Indian name would have been more honest, but also more disqualifying. My manager assured me it wasn't a problem, but also made comments about how I should use whatever name I was comfortable with, language that suggested Ryan was actually the more appropriate choice for the corporate environment despite being a complete fabrication. The professional consequences of revealing my real name included subtle shifts in how colleagues interacted with me. Suddenly I was getting questions about my cultural background, assumptions about my technical abilities based on Indian stereotypes, and comments about how I didn't seem like a Rajesh, whatever that meant. The ethnicity that had been invisible when I was Ryan became hyper-visible as Rajesh, changing workplace dynamics in ways that confirmed why name-based discrimination was such a powerful barrier for ethnic minorities. The continued pressure to use Ryan came from well-meaning colleagues who suggested that sticking with the Americanized name would be easier for everyone and help me fit in better with corporate culture, advice that reinforced how my real identity was considered a professional inconvenience requiring management. Some colleagues continued calling me Ryan even after I asked them to use Rajesh, claiming they couldn't get used to the change in ways that revealed their discomfort with ethnic names and their assumption that I should accommodate their preferences rather than asserting my right to my own identity. The family pain was significant when I had to tell my parents that I had been hiding the name they gave me because it was preventing me from getting jobs. Watching their pride in my Duke MBA transform into hurt that their son was ashamed of his heritage and anger that American discrimination forced minorities to erase cultural identity just to access economic opportunity. My father's comment that they won't let you be Indian even when you're qualified captured the fundamental injustice of systematic bias that treats ethnic identity as a disqualifying characteristic regardless of actual credentials. The broader pattern recognition came as I connected with other ethnic minorities who had engaged in similar resume whitewashing, changing Muhammad to Mo, Lakshmi to Lucky, Svetlana to Lana, and countless other identity erasures that revealed how systematic name-based discrimination was forcing millions of qualified professionals to hide who they were just to get past the first screening. The shared experiences validated that this wasn't paranoia or oversensitivity, but documented bias that had been proven in multiple research studies across industries and geographic regions. The breaking point came during a team meeting when a colleague made a joke about unpronounceable ethnic names and how it would consider it when people adopted American nicknames, looking at me approvingly as if I should be congratulated for making everyone comfortable by erasing my Indian identity. The casual way that assimilation was praised while cultural authenticity was treated as inconvenient crystallized how deeply name-based discrimination was embedded in workplace culture and how much psychological violence I was doing to myself by participating in my own erasure. The mental health crisis that followed included depression related to identity fragmentation, anxiety about authentic self-presentation, and a developing sense of disconnection from my cultural heritage and family history. I started having panic attacks about whether I was Rajesh or Ryan, feeling like I had internalized the discrimination so deeply that I didn't even know who I was anymore. The therapy sessions revealed that I was experiencing cultural identity crisis brought on by systematic pressure to choose between economic survival and authentic existence. The therapy that began during my crisis was with Dr. Priya Chandrasekhar, an Indian-American psychologist who specialized in treating ethnic minorities dealing with workplace discrimination and acculturation stress. She helped me understand that my experience with resume whitewashing represented a form of forced assimilation that violated fundamental human rights to cultural identity and personal dignity, and that the choice between authentic name and economic opportunity was a false one created by systematic bias rather than a legitimate trade-off I should have to accept. Name-based discrimination is one of the most pervasive and documented forms of employment bias, yet it's also one of the least challenged because it operates invisibly at the resume screening stage, Dr. Chandrasekhar explained during one of our sessions. Research shows that identical resumes with white-sounding names receive 50% more callbacks than resumes with ethnic names. But because most applicants never know why they're being rejected, they blame themselves rather than recognizing the systematic discrimination that's actually occurring. She helped me understand that reclaiming my real name wasn't just about personal authenticity, but about challenging the systematic bias that forced millions of ethnic minorities to choose between cultural identity and economic opportunity. Every time someone like me hid their ethnic name to get a job interview, we collectively reinforced the idea that ethnic identity was something shameful that needed to be concealed rather than valuable diversity that should be respected and welcomed in professional environments. The name reclamation process involved gradually reintroducing myself as Rajesh rather than Ryan in professional contexts, correcting colleagues who continued using the Americanized version, and updating all my professional materials to reflect my real identity despite knowing it might limit future opportunities. The process was psychologically difficult because it required asserting the value of my authentic identity in environments that had systematically communicated that ethnic names were professional liabilities. The documentation practice that emerged from therapy involved keeping records of name-based discrimination incidents, including colleagues' refusal to use my real name, comments about ethnic names being difficult, and any professional consequences that seemed related to my decision to stop hiding my identity. The documentation helped validate my experiences and establish patterns that revealed how deeply name-based bias was embedded in workplace interactions and career advancement decisions. The advocacy development began when I started speaking publicly about my resume whitewashing experience and the systematic name-based discrimination that forces ethnic minorities to hide their identities. I share my story with diversity and inclusion professionals, HR leaders, and corporate executives to help them understand how unconscious bias in hiring processes creates massive barriers for qualified candidates whose only deficiency is having a name that doesn't sound white. The research collaboration with organizational psychologists studying name-based discrimination helped document the extent and impact of ethnic name bias across industries. We conducted expanded resume studies that confirmed my personal experience. Identical qualifications attached to ethnic names receive significantly fewer callbacks across finance, technology, healthcare, and virtually every professional sector, revealing that name-based discrimination was a universal barrier rather than an isolated problem in specific industries. The policy advocacy included working with companies to implement blind resume screening processes that remove names and other identifying information from initial application reviews, forcing hiring decisions to focus on qualifications rather than ethnic identity signals. The blind screening dramatically increased diversity in interview pools and revealed how many qualified ethnic minority candidates had been systematically excluded by name-based bias in traditional hiring processes. The LinkedIn campaign I launched encouraged other ethnic minorities to share their resume whitewashing stories using the hashtag #MyRealName. creating a viral movement that exposed how widespread identity erasure had become and how many professionals were hiding their ethnic identities just to access employment opportunities. The campaign generated thousands of stories from people across industries and ethnic backgrounds who would change Jose to Joe, Exine to Cindy, Kala to Carl, and countless other identity erasures forced by systematic discrimination. The corporate training work that emerged from my advocacy includes presentations to HR professionals and hiring managers about unconscious name bias and strategies for creating more equitable screening processes. I share research showing that diverse names don't correlate with lower job performance, but do correlate with higher rejection rates, revealing that name-based discrimination is pure bias rather than legitimate assessment of candidate quality. The mentorship relationships I've developed focus on supporting young ethnic minorities who are facing pressure to whitewash their resumes and need validation that their real names and authentic identities are valuable rather than shameful. I work to help men understand their legal rights, document discrimination when it occurs, and make informed decisions about how to navigate biased hiring systems without internalizing the message that their ethnic identity is a professional liability. Today, I work as a senior financial analyst at my firm, while also serving on diversity advisory boards focused on eliminating name-based discrimination in hiring processes. I use my real name exclusively in all professional contexts and actively correct anyone who tries to shorten or Americanize it, asserting my right to my authentic identity regardless of others' discomfort with ethnic names. The speaking and consulting work that emerged from my experience includes presentations at business schools and professional conferences about resume whitewashing and the systematic barriers that name-based discrimination creates for ethnic minorities. I share my story to help others understand that identity erasure isn't a victimless strategy, but a form of psychological violence that we do to ourselves when systematic bias forces impossible choices between authenticity and opportunity. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. Professional therapy with culturally competent providers who understand acculturation stress and identity-related trauma helps process the psychological impact of forced assimilation and develop strategies for authentic self-presentation. Organizations like Asian Americans Advancing Justice, South Asian Americans Leading Together, SALT, and other ethnic advocacy groups provide resources for challenging name-based discrimination and supporting authentic identity in professional contexts. Research on name-based hiring discrimination provides empirical evidence of systematic bias and supports advocacy for blind resume screening and other equity-focused hiring practices. Documentation practices help establish patterns of name-based discrimination that can support legal complaints when ethnic identity affects employment decisions in violation of anti-discrimination laws. Corporate diversity initiatives that implement blind screening processes and name bias training help reduce the impact of unconscious prejudice in hiring decisions and create more equitable opportunities for ethnic minorities. Legal consultation services inform minorities about their rights under employment discrimination law and the circumstances under which name-based hiring decisions constitute illegal bias. Mentorship networks provide peer support and guidance for navigating identity-related employment challenges while maintaining connection to cultural heritage and authentic self-expression. Social media campaigns like #MyRealName create community awareness about resume whitewashing and challenge the normalization of identity erasure as a requirement for professional opportunity. Today, when I meet ethnic minorities who are considering whitewashing their resumes to improve job prospects, I tell them that their real names are beautiful and valuable, that the problem is systematic discrimination rather than their identity, and that every time we hide who we are, we reinforce the bias that forced that choice. Reclaiming our real names is an act of resistance against systematic discrimination, and building a professional life that honors authentic identity is not only possible, but represents a dignity that every person deserves regardless of how their name sounds to white ears.